The diagnosis took 4 minutes to deliver and a lifetime to absorb. Across the desk, Dr. Whitfield kept his eyes on the folder instead of her face, the way people do when they're about to take something from you. Hereditary cardiomyopathy, he said. Not fatal on its own, but it meant no children would ever be safe to carry, not without a risk that no insurance company and no family would call acceptable. Audrey Lindqvist sat with her hands folded in her lap, nodding at words she wasn't really hearing anymore, because she already knew what this meant for her standing in the Lindqvist house. It meant nothing. It meant she had become, overnight, a daughter, with no use left in her. She drove home along the river road with the windows down, letting the cold air do the crying for her. And by the time she pulled into the gravel driveway of her father's house in the hills outside Asheville, she had composed her face into something steady enough to survive dinner. It didn't survive dinner. Her father, Walter Lindqvist, had built his fortune in shipping contracts that everyone in town politely called logistics, and nobody asked too many questions about. Because the Lindqvist name carried a kind of weight that made curiosity inconvenient. He had raised Audrey the way you raise an asset, privately educated, conservatory, trained on the cello, because a daughter with culture photographed well at gala dinners, dressed always one notch above what the room required. And for 26 years, Audrey had told herself that the coldness in the house was just how powerful men loved, sideways and silent. She told her parents about the diagnosis over the second course because she couldn't carry it alone through an entire meal. Her mother set down her fork very precisely, the way she did everything, and said, "Well, that changes things, doesn't it?" It changed everything. Within a week, the marriage her father had been quietly engineering with the Castellano shipping family collapsed, because Dario Castellano's mother had made it abundantly clear that her son needed sons, plural, and a bride who couldn't deliver them was, in her words, an unfortunate complication. Walter didn't yell. He was worse than a man who yelled. He simply stopped looking at Audrey when she entered a room, as if she had already become furniture. 2 weeks after that, he called her into his study, the room she had always associated with punishment, with the smell of cedar and scotch and disappointment. There was a man already seated in the leather chair across from her father's desk, a man she had never met, broad-shouldered, dark-suited, with a stillness about him that made the air in the room feel thinner. His name, her father said without preamble, was Sebastian Calloway. He ran half the import business on the eastern seaboard that didn't show up on any public ledger, and he had recently lost his wife, and he had 4 children who, Walter said with the tone of a man discussing a logistics problem, needed managing. "You're going to marry him," her father said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't framed as a kindness, though her father seemed to think he was doing her one, taking damaged goods off his hands, and into a household where her infertility, for once, might be considered an asset rather than a flaw, since Sebastian Calloway already had all the heirs he would ever need. Audrey looked at the man in the chair. He hadn't said a single word since she walked in. He was studying her the way you'd study a structural beam you weren't sure could bear weight, not unkindly, but without warmth either. "Do I get a say in this?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "No," her father said. Sebastian Calloway finally spoke. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had clearly spent years not needing to raise itself to be obeyed. "She can have a say in mine," he said, looking at Walter, not at her. "I'm not buying a broodmare, Lindqvist. I'm hiring a mother for 4 children who haven't said a full sentence to an adult in months. If she doesn't want the job, I'll find someone else." It was the first time in 2 weeks that anyone had spoken about her as though she were a person with a choice in front of her, even if the choice itself was a cage dressed up as a door. Audrey looked at her father's face. The blankness there, the complete absence of any flicker that resembled love, and she made a decision that had less to do with Sebastian Calloway and everything to do with never wanting to sit in this house again. "I'll do it," she said, "but I want to meet them first, the children." Something shifted very slightly in Sebastian's jaw, something that might have been surprise. The Calloway estate sat on 11 private acres outside Greenwich, a house built of grey stone and old money, with a wrought iron gate that clicked shut behind the car, the way Audrey imagined a cell door might, except this cell had topiary gardens and a view of the Sound. Sebastian walked her up the front steps himself, and she noticed the staff didn't make eye contact with him, the way people avoid the eyes of something they respect and fear in equal measure. The 4 children were arranged in the foyer like a small, silent jury. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 12 named Theo, stood with his arms crossed and his chin lifted in open hostility. Beside him, a girl of 9, Margot, stared at the floor and said nothing, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. The 2 younger ones, twins around 6, a boy and a girl named Otis and Ren, hid half behind Margot's legs, peering out at Audrey like she was something that might bite. "This is Audrey," Sebastian said to them, his voice gentler than it had been in Walter's study, but still carrying that same unmistakable authority. "She's going to be staying with us. Is she another one of the babysitters Aunt Liliane keeps sending?" Theo asked, not bothering to look at Audrey when he said it. "Because the last one cried within a week." "I'm not a babysitter," Audrey said, crouching slightly so she was closer to Ren's eye level, though she kept her attention mostly on Theo, sensing he was the wall she'd have to get through first. "I'm not going to pretend I'm your mother either. I don't know your mother. I don't know what she sounded like or what songs she sang or what she'd say to you right now. I'm not going to try to fill a hole that size. I just want to know your names properly, if that's all right." Theo blinked. It wasn't the answer he'd been braced for. "I'm Theo," he said finally, grudgingly. "That's Margot. The twins are Otis and Ren." "Thank you, Theo," Audrey said, and stood back up and didn't push any further, because she understood instinctively. The way she understood phrasing in music, the silences that mattered as much as the notes, that the first lesson these children needed wasn't trust. It was patience. Someone who wouldn't flinch and wouldn't leave. The wedding, when it came 3 weeks later, was a quiet, civil affair attended by almost no one Audrey actually wanted there. Her father, stone-faced, treating the whole event as a contract closing, her mother dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief for the photographs, and a handful of Calloway business associates who watched Audrey the way men watch a new piece of furniture being delivered, assessing whether it would hold up. Sebastian stood beside her in a charcoal suit, his hand steady at the small of her back, and when the officiant pronounced them married, he leaned down and murmured, "Just for her. You don't have to perform happiness for these people. Just get through it." It was, strangely, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in a month. The first weeks in the Calloway house were an exercise in small failures and smaller victories. Margot wouldn't speak above a whisper. Otis had nightmares that woke the whole East Wing. Ren wouldn't eat unless someone sat with her the entire meal in total silence, as if conversation might cause the food to disappear. Theo was the hardest, a boy who had decided, somewhere in the month since his mother's death, that anger was safer than grief, because grief required you to admit something was gone for good. Audrey didn't try to force any of it. She started small. She left her cello case open in the music room, not playing, just leaving it visible, the way you leave a door unlocked for someone who isn't ready to walk through it yet. It was Margot who came in first, 3 days later, standing in the doorway for a long time before asking, in a voice barely above breath, if Audrey could play something. She played a Bach suite, something slow and unadorned, and when she looked up halfway through, Otis and Ren had crept in too, sitting cross-legged on the rug. And even Theo was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, pretending he wasn't listening. That became the ritual. Every evening, after dinner, the cello, and slowly, the room filled a little more. Each time, the silence in the children growing less brittle. Sebastian noticed before he said anything about it. Audrey would catch him sometimes in the hallway outside the music room, not entering, just standing there with his hand on the doorframe, listening, his face unreadable but his shoulders, she noticed, looser than they were at the dinner table. He ran a business that required him to be unreadable. For a living, she would learn. The kind of business where a man named Reyes had once shown up at the house with a face full of bruises and left an hour later having had a very quiet conversation with Sebastian in the study. A conversation Audrey was not invited to and didn't ask about, understanding the boundary instinctively the way she understood which notes in a chord you didn't resolve too early. It was Ren who broke first, fully, 3 weeks in. She'd had a nightmare, the kind that left her shaking and unable to explain what she'd seen, and when Audrey came into her room to sit with her, the girl had climbed straight into her lap without asking, burying her face against Audrey's collarbone, and whispered, "Don't go away," like she did. Audrey held her until the shaking stopped and didn't promise anything she couldn't keep, because these children had already learned the cost of broken promises. "I'm here right now," she said instead. "And I'm planning on being here tomorrow too." It wasn't a vow, it was a fact, repeated nightly, until eventually it became something the children could believe in. Theo took longer. He tested her constantly, in the way wounded things test the hand that feeds them, looking for the moment it would pull back. He skipped tutoring sessions. He came home from school with the kind of silence that meant something had happened. He wasn't going to discuss. One night, 3 months into the marriage, he came down to the kitchen at midnight to find Audrey sitting at the counter, unable to sleep, working through a new piece on sheet music spread in front of her. "You're not even trying to make us like you," he said, sitting down across from her without being invited, which she recognized as progress disguised as accusation. "I'm not trying to make you like me," she agreed. "I'm trying to not be one more person who leaves." Theo was quiet for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Everyone leaves," he said. "Mom died. Dad's never home. The nannies quit. Grandma Liliane only visits when there's a photographer." "I'm not your mum," Audrey said again, the same thing she'd said the first day, but this time the weight of it had changed, softened by months of evenings filled with cello and quiet patience. "I never will be. But I'm not going anywhere, Theo. Not because your father is paying me to stay. Because I want to." He didn't say anything to that. But the next evening, for the first time, he was the one who asked her to play. The thaw in the children mirrored something happening more slowly, more carefully, between Audrey and Sebastian. He was not a man who gave away pieces of himself easily. She learned that from the way he discussed his late wife only in fragments, never a full story, just enough that Audrey understood the grief was real and the wound still raw, 2 years on. But he was attentive in ways she hadn't expected from a man his father-in-law had described like a transaction. He noticed when she was exhausted before she did. He started leaving the study door open on the evenings he worked late, an invitation she didn't immediately understand until she realized it meant she was welcome to sit in the room with him, the way the children had been welcome in the music room. Proximity offered before words were ready. One evening in early winter, after the children were asleep, she found him in his study with a bottle of bourbon he wasn't drinking, just turning the glass slowly on the desk. "Raise again?" she asked, because she'd learned enough by now to read the particular stillness that meant business trouble. "Someone's been skimming off a shipment that isn't supposed to exist," he said, which was as close to honesty as he ever got with her about his work, and she understood it was a kind of trust, being told even that much. "It'll be handled. You don't have to protect me from knowing things," Audrey said. "I already know what I'm married into." He looked up at her then properly, in a way he rarely allowed himself. "You married into it because your father sold you," he said. "Not because you chose it." "I'm choosing it now," she said, and meant it, and watched something in his face come undone, just slightly, the way a held breath finally releases. He didn't kiss her that night. It took another month for that, a slow unfolding rather than a single moment, born out of 100 small evenings of cello music and shared silences and a man who had stopped flinching when she touched his arm. When he finally did kiss her, in the music room, with bark still hanging in the air, it felt less like a beginning than like the acknowledgement of something that had already been growing quietly for weeks. The danger, when it came from the direction Audrey least expected. Not from Sebastian's enemies, but from her own father. Walter Lindqvist had not anticipated that giving away a daughter he considered worthless would result in her finding a place where she was valued, and the sight of it, when he visited for what he called a business dinner with Sebastian, curdled something in him. He drank too much. He made a comment about Audrey's barren womb in front of the children, the kind of cruelty he'd perfected over 26 years, and Theo, who 6 months earlier had refused to even say a full sentence to Audrey, stood up from the table and told his grandfather by marriage to leave. It was Ren who started crying. It was Margot who, astonishingly, found her voice to say, quite clearly, "You're not allowed to talk to our mom like that, our mom." Audrey heard it before she understood what it meant, heard it land in the room like something shifting permanently into place. Sebastian didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply stood, walked around the table, and informed Walter Lindqvist, with a calm that was somehow more frightening than shouting, that he was no longer welcome in the house, and that any future business between the Calloway and Lindqvist names was, as of that moment, concluded. Walter left in a fury that night, and within the week word reached Sebastian. Through channels Audrey didn't ask too many questions about. That her father had gone to certain old associates, men with grudges of their own against the Calloway operation, looking to make trouble out of spite, the kind of trouble that didn't care who got hurt in the making of it. The warning came on a Thursday night, delivered by a man Audrey had only ever seen standing silently near the gates. Sebastian's face, when he read the message, went the particular grey of a man calculating how much time he had. "Lock the doors," he said to the staff, already moving toward the stairs, toward the children's rooms. Now. Audrey didn't ask questions. She'd learned, in 6 months of marriage, when questions were a luxury and when they were a danger. She gathered Ren and Otis from their beds, half asleep and frightened, while Sebastian woke Theo and Margot's, and the 6 of them moved to the reinforced room behind the library. A room Audrey hadn't known existed until that night, a room built by a man who had always understood that safety was never guaranteed, only prepared for. They heard the disturbance outside for almost 20 minutes. Voices, the distant slam of a car door, once a sound that might have been gunfire and might have been something else entirely, because Sebastian's hand found Audrey's in the dark and held it tightly enough that she didn't ask. Ren had her face pressed into Audrey's side. Theo stood near the door, jaw set, trying to look braver than a 12-year-old should have to. When the all-clear finally came, hours later, it came from Reyes himself, his voice rough through the door, telling them it was over, that the men her father had sent had been intercepted before they ever reached the house, that Walter Lindqvist's reach, it turned out, had never been as long as he believed it was. Sebastian's grip on her hand loosened slowly, and in the grey light just before dawn, he pulled her against him, his face pressed into her hair, and she felt, for the first time since Dr. Whitfield's office, something that wasn't fear or grief or obligation. It was relief shaped like belonging. "You didn't have to stay in that room with us," he said quietly. Once the children had finally drifted to sleep, piled together on the floor cushions like they used to do as toddlers, before grief had taught them to keep their distance from each other too. "You could have run the second things got dangerous. Most people would have." "I'm not most people," Audrey said, "and these aren't most children. They're mine now, whether or not I gave birth to a single one of them." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded in his face that she hadn't seen even in their most private moments. "I didn't think I'd want this again," he admitted. "A family. A wife who wasn't just managing a house. I told myself after Camille died that this part of my life was finished, that the kids and I would just get through it, day by day, and that would have to be enough. And now? Now I can't imagine the house without you in it," he said. "I haven't been able to for months." It wasn't a grand declaration, not the kind that would have made for an easy story to tell at the dinner parties her mother used to host, but it was true in a way nothing in Audrey's life before this house had ever been true, and that was enough. Walter Lindqvist never came back to Greenwich. Word eventually filtered through that he'd lost more than his dignity in the fallout. that certain doors in his own world had closed to him permanently once it became known he'd tried to move against the Calloway name, and failed, that the men he'd once commanded respect from now treated him the way he'd once treated his own daughter, as something used up and discarded. Audrey felt when she heard, not triumph exactly, but a quiet settling, the closing of a door she'd been afraid would never fully shut. Spring came to the estate slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, and with it came small, ordinary miracles that meant more to Audrey than any grand gesture could have. Wren stopped having nightmares most nights. Otis started bringing home drawings from school. Stick figures labelled Dad, Mum, Theo, Margos, Otis, Wren, 6 figures holding hands in crayon, and Audrey kept every single one pinned to the corkboard in the music room where she could see them while she played. Margot found her voice fully, not just in private moments, but at the dinner table, telling stories about her day with an animation that made Sebastian's whole face soften every time. And Theo, who had once told her everyone leaves, asked her one ordinary Tuesday evening, completely without ceremony, if she'd come to his school's spring concert, because he was playing cello too now, badly but trying, and he wanted her in the audience. "Of course I'll be there," Audrey said, and watched the boy who had once crossed his arms at her in the foyer try and fail to hide how much that answer meant to him. The real wedding, the one that mattered, the one neither of them had planned, happened almost by accident. On the 1-year anniversary of the civil ceremony, Walter Lindqvist had treated like a contract closing. Sebastian had arranged nothing elaborate, just the back lawn at dusk. String lights threaded through the trees, the 4 children dressed in their good clothes. Reyes standing awkwardly off to one side because Sebastian had asked him to be there, and a small string quartet Sebastian had hired without telling Audrey, because he remembered somehow every small thing she'd ever mentioned loving. "We already did this," Audrey said, laughing despite the tears gathering in her eyes as he took her hands in the fading light. "That one was for your father," Sebastian said. "This one's for us." Wren was the flower girl, scattering petals with the seriousness of a child performing an important duty. Margot stood beside Audrey holding the small bouquet, beaming in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the silent girl from 6 months earlier. Theo, in his first real suit, stood as something like a best man, solemn and proud. Otis cried loudly for no particular reason except that he was 6 and the night felt big and important, and nobody hushed him for it. When Sebastian said his vows low and unrehearsed, he didn't talk about business or alliances, or the things her father had once tried to reduce her to. He talked about a woman who had walked into a house full of grieving children and never once flinched, who had filled a silent music room with sound until laughter came back into it, who had chosen 4 children that weren't biologically hers and loved them as fiercely as if they had been, who had stayed through a night of locked doors and gunfire in the dark because she'd decided, somewhere along the way, that this family was worth staying for. "You were never broken," he told her, his voice catching slightly. The only time she'd ever heard it do that. "You were just waiting for people who could see what you actually were." That night, after the children had finally been carried up to bed, full of cake and overtired joy, Sebastian found Audrey on the back terrace, looking out over the dark water of the Sound, the string lights still glowing faintly behind them. "No regrets?" he asked, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers the way it always did now, automatic, certain. She thought of the sterile white walls of Dr. Whitfield's office, of her father's voice calling her worthless, of the silent foyer and 4 wary children sizing her up like a threat. She thought of how far that silence had traveled to become this. Laughter in a music room, crayon drawings of a family that had built itself out of grief and stubborn love rather than blood. "None," she said. "Not one." He walked her back inside, through the house that had become, somewhere in the space of a single ordinary year, entirely and unmistakably hers, and upstairs, in 4 different rooms, 4 children slept soundly, certain for the first time in a long time that when they woke up, she would still be there.